Well, praise God. Daniel chapter 3, the very famous Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego in the fiery furnace. But why did they end up there? Do you remember? Well, we're going to look at that, and it all begins with the king having a massive gold statue created. Then he commands all the rulers and officials from his vast kingdom to all come for the statue's dedication. And that would have been a lot of official people. And remember, they don't travel alone. We're talking big shots. And big shots, they travel with wealth, so they need a lot of armed guards to protect against bandits and so forth. And Nebuchadnezzar, the great king of all of Babylon, says worshiping the statue is a command, not an option. So with that introduction, let's see what we can learn from Daniel chapter 3. I'm going to read the first 6 verses, and then we'll talk a little bit. So King Nebuchadnezzar created a statue of gold that was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. He set it up on the Dura plain north of Babylon. Then he had all the governors, officials, treasurers, judges, advisors, and every other official to come for the dedication of the statue he had created. So all of the governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, and other officials gathered for the dedication of this statue. The king's official announcer loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, the king commands that when you hear the sound of any horn, flute, stringed instrument, any sort of music, you will fall down and worship the statue of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has created. Anyone who does not immediately fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace." Okay, all those in favor of living say, I'm going to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. And remember, if he tells all these officials they have to worship that statue, then everyone else will too. I mean, people follow leaders, except in America. We tend to object to our leaders. If the president's Democrat, he's got his detractors. If the president's Republican, he's got his detractors, and sometimes they're the same detractors for both of them, and you just never know. Well, this wasn't America. You're going to do what the officials say. I mean, the king can have anybody killed for any reason. Nobody can question him. He can just say, yeah, I feel like it. So the blazing furnace. Was this a regular method of execution for King Nebuchadnezzar? Or did he set up a special blazing furnace just right next to the statue as a new method of execution? What do you think? Well, we aren't really told in the Bible what was going on there. However, it would make sense that Babylon had furnaces. Do you know why? I said furnaces, not furnace. And no doubt the statue was near one of them. Here's where you need to understand the context. Not just in the Bible, but in the culture. See, Daniel's story, King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, occurred during what is typically called the Iron Age. And Babylon would have had furnaces for melting iron ore to purify it and then form weapons and tools out of the iron. And if you want to melt rock that's got iron in it, you're going to have to be very hot. So that's why the Bible uses the term blazing furnace in Hebrew, well, Aramaic. I keep saying Hebrew for Daniel. It's Aramaic. But it says blazing furnace. Not just furnace, a blazing one. So I guess the difference would be a furnace would be for making clay pots. Blazing furnace is for melting iron. All right, so verse 7. So as soon as they heard the sound of any horn, flute, stringed instrument, or any sort of music, all the people from every nation and language fell down and worshipped the gold statue the king had created. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I didn't mean to, but I got to. First off, yes, the book of Daniel repeats all the officials twice in one paragraph, and all of these instruments are named here, but this is just for your entertainment. If you browse various translations, you will find a very large variance in what instruments appear in verse 7. Now, what's important for you to understand is that when the people heard any music, evidently on that day, then they should worship. The instruments they had in those days were various forms of horns and stringed instruments and drums. And which Aramaic words were used are not really that important. However, I was bored one day, so I browsed several dozen translations. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I found all of the following instruments listed in this, he's got about 6 or 7 instruments listed here in the Aramaic, Hebrew. How many of them do you know? From all the different translations, how many do you know for certain they did not have back then? Okay, so different translations list, not all of them list all of these, just cornet, trumpet, very similar instruments if you didn't know, a horn, a ram's horn, a flute, a double flute, a pipe, a harp, a triangle harp, 3-stringed harp, a dulcimer, a lyre, L-Y-R-E, a 4-string lyre, the drum. Okay, I already knew all of those. How did you do? I mean, cornet and trumpet are, to most of us, and I was a band nerd in high school. I couldn't tell the difference between a trumpet and cornet. I didn't play either one. We had both. Horn, ram's horn, kind of the same. Flute, double flute. Like flute is one, and a double flute is like you got 2 tubes going. I don't know. And a pipe, I'm thinking that's more like, 5 or 6 tubes, air passages. I don't know. Harp, triangle harp would be shaped different, I guess. I mean, a harp or a harp. Or a 3-stringed harp, just 3 strings, kind of weird. Dulcimer, lyre. Lyre's a form of harp. Dulcimer, no, I don't really know that one. 4-string lyre, lyre, I don't know how many. 4-string lyre, 4. Drum. Okay, now, there's some more here. Sackbut. I didn't bother to go look. Psaltery. I think that might be a harp of some sort. Zither. I think that's, and psaltery, by the way, is P-S-A-L-T-E-R, like Psalms, only psaltery. Zither, I think that's a form of a harp, but I don't remember why I think that. A trigon. To me, it sounds like a triangle. I don't know. Sambuca. Isn't that a kind of drum? I'm not sure. And then, believe it or not, I found more than one translation that said bagpipes. People, I don't think bagpipes existed in Babylon. I thought they only came from Scotland. I don't know. And then in place of, in my paraphrase, I used any other in music. There were also 4 other words used in these translations. Instead of any other music, if you hear a band, a symphony, an ensemble, or a concert. All right, enough of the fun. Let's get back to the story. Verses 8 through 12. That was when some of the king's advisors approached the king and criticized the Jews. They told the king, "May our king live forever. You have ordered that when anyone hears the sound of any horn, flute, stringed instrument, or any sort of music, they must fall down immediately and worship the gold statue. That anyone who does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace." However, Some of the Jews that you put in charge of the region of Babylon have ignored your commands. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not serve your gods, and they will not worship the gold statue you have created. All right. They start out with praising the king. May our king live forever. That was real common in the ancient days of kings. You always start out by flattering the king, and live forever is, that's what all the kings wanted for sure. So then, it says, I started to say fiery furnace because that's the King James Version, but it's blazing furnace in the Aramaic, more or less, as best as I can translate. So I got to ask you, do you think these advisors were jealous based on what happened in chapter 2 when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, along with Daniel, were elevated, above everyone else? I mean, in the region of Babylon. So anyway, I think maybe they were jealous. They went after him. And that was when, chapter 2, that's when Daniel explained the king's dream and told the king what his dream was and then explained it. Well, he rescued all these men from execution. But, a lot of people just can't stand to owe anyone anything. And I think that's what was going on. Anyway, hearing this in verse 13, the king became very angry. He summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they were brought to the king. He asked them, "Is this true? You refuse to serve my gods and refuse to worship my gold statue? I will give you one more chance. As soon as you hear the sound of any flute, horn, stringed instrument, or any sort of music, you be ready to fall down and worship the gold statue, and everything will be forgiven. If you do not worship the statue, you will be thrown into a blazing furnace immediately. You will learn that no God can rescue you from my commands." Wow. In those ancient days, people were expected to worship whatever God their king worshipped. And it really wasn't that big a deal. People kind of went with the flow as far as what God they were going to worship. You know what I mean? That's why the Jews and then later Christians were so unique. So, as these nasty men wanted, the king became angry. And it would have been nice if he had remembered the previous event in the part Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had played when they prayed with David or Daniel. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to remember that event. And why wouldn't he remember? Are you thinking here? What reasons can you think of that might cause the king to forget these three men? I mean, he elevated them to very important positions. Perhaps it's a few years after chapter 2. That's possible. However, let's look at it another way. The king ruled a massive kingdom. So it's probably difficult to keep track of all his officials. That's why he would rely on his advisors, and that was who was misleading him in this story. So how big was his kingdom? It covered what's called modern-day Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Kuwait, and part of Turkey. The actual population of his kingdom is unknown. We do know the city of Babylon had, we're pretty certain, about 200,000 people. In a world where best guess is there was somewhere between, call it 30 million people in the Middle East, his kingdom. Probably about 200 million people in the world. And his kingdom. had, his capital city had 1% of that, and his kingdom had, more than 10% of the population of the world at that time. It was massive. So, trying to keep track of all those officials, I get that. But this is just another reminder that understanding history and culture can help us understand the Bible. Do you understand how great King Nebuchadnezzar was at his time, during his day? He was more powerful than the President of the United States, by far. So here we go. Verses 16 to 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. O King Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to defend ourselves to you regarding this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from the blazing furnace, and he is able to deliver us from your majesty's control. However, even if our God chooses not to deliver us, we want you to know, King, we will not serve your gods or worship your gold statue. My heroes. God can save us, but if he chooses not to, we're good. Far too many Christians today only love and trust God as long as he blesses them. Oh, we don't admit that, but it's true. But the Bible's full of stories about people who went through rough, even terrible times before God used them for great things. God was building their strength and character in preparation for becoming the people that we admire today. And Daniel and his 3 friends, of course, follow that. But how about Joseph? He became a slave and then went to prison for 13 years before he became second in command of Egypt, who was the most powerful kingdom in the world at that time. That's after this. Moses spent 40 years in Egypt and then 40 years in the wilderness before God said, okay, you're old enough, go get my people out of Egypt. David had to overcome his youth, and he was his small size. He was the shortest of his brothers, the smallest of his brothers. And when he faced Goliath was a giant. David was maybe 5'4". Saul was probably 6 foot. He was head and shoulders above anybody else in Israel. And Goliath was 9'9", and David's 5'4". And David had to fight against Goliath and Saul. He waited 15 years after he became anointed by Samuel before he became king. And all that 15 years he had Saul trying to kill him. Many prophets like Jeremiah faced persecution from God's own people. Job certainly went through some very difficult times. Yeah, he's famous for that. Abraham left his home and wandered for 25 years before God fulfilled his promise that Abraham would have a son. He was 75 years old when he started wandering. Jacob served for 14 years in order to marry the woman he loved. A good story. John the Baptist, he prepared throughout his whole life for a ministry that only lasted a year or two. And his life was a wild man. Dear Christians, are you what I call a microwave Christian? Meaning, I want it now. Whatever it is you want. My wife's favorite illustration of a microwave Christian is people that say, I want patience and I want it now. How ironic. But it's kind of true for a lot of us. All right. So, verses 19 to 23. A lot of side trips here. I must be in a mood. 19 to 23. Nebuchadnezzar became furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. People, you don't talk to the king like that. You don't. So Nebuchadnezzar became furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. His attitude immediately changed, and he ordered the furnace to be made 7 times hotter than normal. He also commanded some of his strongest soldiers to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the fiery furnace. So the 3 Jews, wearing robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were tied up, thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was for immediate action. The furnace was so hot that the flames coming out of the furnace killed the soldiers carrying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The 3 Jews, still tied up, fell into the blazing furnace. Okay, context. Let's stick with context, this theme today. Why did Daniel describe what they were wearing in such detail? Why? I never thought of that. And I've never heard that. But do you know why? Why did Daniel describe what they were wearing in such detail? Think about it. In my opinion, it isn't that what they were wearing was important. What seems more important is that they were not wearing anything close to protective clothing. Whatever protects you from an iron melting furnace that's 7 times hotter than that, I'm not even sure asbestos suit that covers your whole body is going to protect you. Oh, people, what would it have been like to watch this event? Can you imagine seeing it happen? Try to imagine it. They're tied up, wearing their robes. They're thrown in the furnace. The men that threw them in died. And for anyone who's interested, the apocryphal account of, it's called the Prayer of Isaiah, Abednego, the Song of the 3 Jews. A Prayer of Isaiah, Song of the 3 Jews. You should read it right here, between verses 23 and 24. It's kind of interesting. But I've taught that lesson before, and I'll probably teach it again someday, but I included the end of my notes here if you ever ask for them. So verse 24, I'm going to stop in the middle of it. I'm sorry. King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet astonished. He asked his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? If you had been anywhere near King Nebuchadnezzar, which would have been more shocking? What happened to the 3 Jews? Or the king leaping to his feet? I think his advisors were staring at him. Most royalty then and today are raised to not show emotion. Emotion, if you show emotion, it's a weakness in most cases. When I was a fighter, a brawler, before I became a Christian, I would provoke people to become angry, violently angry at me, because then I have won the battle. If I can be so obnoxious that they lose their temper, they don't think. Yeah, I just enjoyed it. I was thinking. Emotions can be difficult. And so royalty's taught not to show emotion. So nobody can read your mind. Poker face. Nobody's going to read my face. That's the way a king was raised. So the king leaping to his feet would have been shocking. And then he looks at his advisors and said, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Clearly a rhetorical question. How do you think his advisors responded, though? Advisor 1 looks at the ground. Advisor 2 looks at the furnace. Advisor 3 stammers, Advisor 4 clears his throat and mutters, yes, but... Advisor 5 looks at the king with eyes wide open, in shock. Advisor 6 whispers so soft the king can't hear him. Of course. Oh. And verse 24 concludes, they replied, of course, king. Who wants to argue with the king? Ancient kingdoms had 2 rules. Rule number 1, the king is always right. Rule number 2, there is no other rule. That's it. So you don't argue with him. If he says the sun came up in the north, you say, yes, king. Kind of weird. Well, I'm not sure you'd want to say that part. 25, the king said, "Look in the furnace. I see 4 men walking around in the fire, not tied and not harmed. The 4th man looks like a son of the gods." Clearly, that 4th man was unusual looking. Could we say perfect? Of course, you and I have been taught that it was Jesus. And I believe that. God Almighty right there with them. How cool would that be? In a blazing furnace. Can I use the word cool? Oh, man. That would have been something for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Hi, God. Nice to see you here. Thanks for saving us, by the way. Well, the king seems like he's very excited. And he focused on that 4th man. Then the king did something even more surprising, in my opinion. He got up, and Nebuchadnezzar, verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar approached the open door of the blazing furnace and shouted out, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the greatest God, come out of there. Come here." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the furnace, and all of the governors, officials, and advisors crowded around them. It was obvious that the furnace had not harmed their bodies. Even the hair on their heads wasn't singed, and their robes were not scorched. They did not even smell like fire. First off, and this isn't in my notes, but I just realized the king didn't ask for the 4th man to come out. That would have been interesting. And then other questions. Do you think Nebuchadnezzar's advisors approached the furnace with him, or do you think they came out after they saw the 3 young Jews? At this time, they're maybe teenagers, maybe early 20s. We don't know. But it seems unlikely, in my opinion, that the advisors went with him. They were probably afraid of such a miraculous event. But that shows how a great king responds, without fear, always. Remember, no emotion. The greatest leaders just assume they can handle anything, and public opinion is not significant to them, then or today. Frankly, people that make a lot of noise about how great they are usually just trying to overcome their own feelings of not being what they proclaim themselves to be. Again, I'll go back to my days as a brawler. The louder they talked, the less I feared. You know, the guys that were a little frightening were the ones that they didn't respond. No matter how I provoked, they didn't respond. That kind of worried me sometimes. They must have known who and what they were. Now, can you imagine, the king shouting into the furnace? How close do you think he got? Really close. No, I don't think so. I mean, why would he be shouting then? Fire. You got to understand this. Fire, a really big fire, makes a roaring noise. I've been where we built massive bonfires. I remember one time a guy dumped 5 gallons of gasoline on a pile about 6 foot tall by about 7 or 8 feet wide all the way around, and he stood back about 6 feet and threw a cigarette lighter into it, a really nice Zippo, and it just exploded into fire with a massive roar. It makes noise. And the king had this furnace 7 times louder. He's shouting. He says, "Hey, gentlemen, would you please come out of there?" I doubt he wanted to get close. And no doubt the king quickly observed that they suffered no burns. Even their hair wasn't singed and their robes were just fine. And they didn't even smell like a fire. All those things are normal around fires. Think about the smell of a fireplace or a burning bonfire of wood, pine. Oh, what a pleasant and noticeable smell. And if you're in a one-room cabin and the fire's going all night long, you can smell it in the morning even if the fire has dwindled to almost nothing. Hair burns very easily. I mean, yeah, and robes, they would have been great for kindling a fire. I doubt they had fireproof robes. That's not normal until recent years. And even now, we don't usually worry about whether my t-shirt is going to be combustible. I assume it will be. All right, 28 and 29. I'll try and wrap this up. Nebuchadnezzar proclaimed, "Praise the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent an angel and rescued his servants. They trusted their God and defied your king's commands. They were willing to die instead of serving or worshiping any god except their own God. I now decree that all the people of any nation or language who speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut into pieces, and their house will be turned into a pile of rubble. No other God can save someone in this manner." What more could I say here? He praised God. And then he promoted them to, verse 30, the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego even higher in the region of Babylon. Of course he'd promote them. Their God was mighty, and the king wanted their God's blessing. Is that your God? Mighty. Seek his blessing. King Nebuchadnezzar did. So should we.